Thank you all very much for coming. There's a saying that you should never meet your heroes, so I was nervous about Robert Shiller coming to the Times on Monday because I found his recent books, both The Subprime Solution and the latest book, Animal Spirits, really inspiring books and also brilliant insights into what's really happening, what has really happened in the credit crunch. They've got to the heart of what is wrong with economic thinking and how it can be enriched. But it wasn't disappointing. We enjoyed an extremely good conversation here about the nature of the recession, that we were facing, and so I've been looking forward since then to sharing that with a broader audience today. What I've discussed with the professor is how we should structure this, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow him the chance in a moment to introduce you to some of the ideas that have been bubbling up for him in the last couple of years as he's watched the subprime crisis and economic theories that are underlie both the mistakes and good ideas that we've had since then. And then I'll ask him some other questions that relate to that before throwing it open to you and giving you the opportunity to do the same thing. I say that it's were ideas that bubble up in the last 2 years, but perhaps it goes back longer. Maybe you can tell us a bit about how some of the ideas that are expressed in Animal Spirits, how long you've been working on those, and what you think their relevance now is.
Well, I think that the thoughts that academics promulgate have a powerful influence on our policy and our lives. There's a famous quote from John Maynard Keynes saying that those academic scribblers have more impact on what happens in the world than you might think. The economics profession has gone through important revolutions. Unfortunately, economists, like everyone else, have a faddish side to them, and they tend to run in packs. There was an important revolution in the 1930s when John Maynard Keynes wrote his classic book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. It was very important because it launched the whole idea of stabilization, fiscal policy in coordination with monetary policy to stabilize an otherwise unstable economy. And Keynes, in that book, used the term animal spirits to refer to what he thought was a driving force for the economy. The term animal spirits is an ancient phrase. In Latin, it's spiritus animalis, and it means the animating spirit that drives people. And it's been used ever since, for 2,000 years. When someone's inspired, we say the animal spirits are showing. But what Keynes emphasized in his 1936 book was that the economics profession was underestimating the impact of animal spirits on people's behavior, and therefore was imposing too much of a theory of rationality on this behavior. What the economists were already doing by the 1930s was developing models of human behavior as if people were calculating probabilities and writing down decision trees. I could go this way or I could go this way, but the probability of this and this happening is, and they do calculations and reach conclusions about what they should do. Now, some people do go through those motions. Maybe it's to impress others. I don't know why. But, or maybe it has some value. But what Keynes emphasizes, do we really know these probabilities? If you're starting a business, how do you know it's going to succeed? I'm almost quoting Keynes. So you're building a building or you're building a new railroad. How do you know that it's a good idea to do that? It all comes down to some kind of intuitive judgment, because nobody can tell you the probabilities. And so what Keynes thought was this kind of intuitive judgment varies through time, and it brings us into bubbles, and when we get overly enthusiastic, and then it reverses, and we end up in busts, where we're very unenthusiastic. So what Keynes was lamenting, he was writing in the middle of the Great Depression in the 1930s. And the problem at that time was very clear. Why were we in a depression? It was because people perceived that we were in a depression. It's as simple as that. To quote Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who also opined on this, the only thing to fear is fear itself. If everybody thinks that the whole economy is in a bad condition, then it will be in a bad condition, because everyone will pull back on all of their expenditure plans. And all of the otherwise entrepreneurs, or many of them, will decide, well, I'd like to be an entrepreneur, but not now. I can't raise any money. Nothing can work now. And so it all becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, this was the Keynesian idea, as I interpret it. But academic economists never felt entirely right with this. And we saw another revolution in economics that occurred notably in the 1960s and 1970s. And it's often called the efficient markets revolution. And it led ultimately then to Thatcherism and Reaganism. And it was a whole new, we kind of began to think that depressions were a thing of the past and couldn't happen again. And we began to think of markets as perfect. That's what efficient markets is. The idea is that the stock market is smarter than any one of us. The stock market is the place where the wisdom of all the people of the world are brought together, and they all vote on the value of something, and the price should be respected by everyone. This was an idea that had its heyday 20 or 30 years ago, and it's still going. It's still a strong thing. And it led to a branch of economics that we felt, George Akerlof and I felt, was leading us astray. So starting in 1994, Akerlof and I created a series of workshops at the National Bureau of Economic Research on what we call behavioral macroeconomics. I'm also working with Richard Thaler on behavioral finance workshops. We've been at this now for almost 20 years, trying to get some more sense, we think, into the economics profession. It's been a hard battle. There was a recent book by, I don't know if you heard, by Levitt and Dubner called Freakonomics. The theme of that book was that people are really rational. So it's still, I actually love that book, by the way, but don't be misled by it. The reality is that people are often proximately rational, but they're subject to some behavior patterns like herd behavior, or attention anomalies, that they assume that everyone else has researched something, and then, so they don't need to research it, and they just follow what other people are doing. And it leads us into mass behavior that's mistaken. But it appears that we're all rational, and in some sense we are. And I'm sounding very abstract at a time when, and maybe you'll direct me elsewhere, at a time when we have a very real world economic crisis enveloping us. But we have our book, Animal Spirits, is really a plea for a different kind of economics. And we're sketching out details of it. It's in a way hearkening back to Keynes, but we've been criticized for our interpretation of Keynes. Maybe we are not the same as Keynes. I think that's all right. We have had more than 50 years of new research on psychology, sociology, political science, and now the exciting new thing is neuroscience. And our concept of the human mind is changing rapidly with these new inventions. And it has to change economics as well. So the things that we emphasize, I'll just give a quick list of in our book as overlooked topics in economics. We're writing now as economists, not neuroscientists, but I think we're part of a movement which will correct economic thinking. The first thing is that confidence changes. I've already alluded to that. But as an important exogenous force driving the economy, that is, the human mind, and this is something that psychologists have emphasized, is very empathetic. Empathy is a 20th century word referring to our tendency to feel each other's feelings. It's different from sympathy. Empathy is when a basketball player is shooting a basket, and in your mind, you're shooting the basket too, because you feel what that person is feeling. It puts us all in sync, and so we often fail to understand that our own thinking is really shared by millions of other people all over, and that, in a sense, our own thoughts are driving the economy. And we also emphasize that the variations in confidence are affected by feedbacks. Notably, when prices go up in the stock market or or the housing market, it attracts our attention, and it generates certain thoughts, and we start talking to each other, and we spread those thoughts. And it then reinforces the price increase. That's what a bubble is. It has an emotional channel. When housing prices are going up, and you're not an investor in real estate, you feel bad. You feel emotions of envy, of lack of fulfillment, lack of excitement in my life, a whole array. When it comes to the decision, am I going to buy a second house as an investment? That's a very emotional decision, and it's affected by the atmosphere. This is bubble, and this is what we've been through in both the US and the UK and many other countries recently. Another thing that we emphasize is fairness. And this is rejected by most economists. It's not in their models. But that people are very alert to being slighted or being treated badly. And so they're reluctant to allow things to happen to them, like a wage cut is, if they don't raise your wage, it's one thing. But if they cut your wage, it's an affront, and it generates anger. So that's one aspect of the theory that suggests there's certain rigidities that are imposed by psychology. Another thing we talk about is corruption, which is rarely talked about by economists as part of a macro thing. But in an expansionary period, like a boom we've seen recently, standards are let down. It's not just corruption, but it's bad faith behavior becomes more common. And so people are unusually trusting during a boom, and bad things start to happen. And then afterwards, they become angry. And the anger becomes part of a change in our thinking that causes us to mistrust each other or to mistrust business contracts. Now I won't sign a document anymore without reading all the fine print and hiring a lawyer. But since I'm not going to do that, I'm just not going to sign the document. All right? So for the same reason, I'm not going to get a loan to buy a house. All this is part of an aspect of mistrust. We also talked about money illusion, and that is that people are confused by inflation or deflation. And even though the British government issued index-linked gilts in almost 20 years, or more than 20 years ago, still most people don't appreciate or understand the logic of it. And there's a potential for big errors to occur if we have a deflation or either that or an inflation, which would cause big dislocations and could exacerbate a crisis. And then finally, we talk about stories. And this is, I think, maybe the most unusual aspect of our book, because it hasn't been talked about by economists. But reading social psychology, an important development that has occurred in the last 10 or so years, is that social psychologists are emphasizing the narrative-based aspect of the human mind. I'm thinking particularly of the social psychologists Roger Schenck and Robert Abelson, who argue that the mind is organized around stories. Newspaper writers will tell you this. You're a newspaper writer. But maybe you don't embody this, but newspaper writers will often tell you that you should start your article with a, quote, human interest story, right? If you write stories about abstract financial statistics, you won't get a readership. But this is revealing something about the human mind. That Schenck and Abelson said that the brain is indexed around stories. You remember stories, and you remember numbers and things only if the stories help you to remember them in your long-term memory. Most of us actually remember remarkably little about us. Our older people among us have almost no memory of our childhood, but we keep together a story of our own childhood, which becomes motivating. I'm just thinking of various psychologists who've said interesting things. Robert Sternberg is a psychologist who wrote a book called Love is a Story. And his idea was that he's talking about successful marriages. Successful marriages seem to him be our stories, in the sense, if you ask the couple to tell a story about each other, they will tell warm and loving stories, like how we met and how she saved me, or that kind of thing. But if you have marriages that are likely to fail, you get very different stories about each other. So in a sense, the economy is a story. And that what happens is, in a boom period, we start telling stories about certain kinds of, during the boom of the 90s for the stock market, or the boom of the 2000s about the housing market, we start telling stories about winners, smart people who bought 3 houses and they made so much money. Those stories become the driving force, we believe, in the...
Well, I just wanted to investigate this use of the term irrational, which comes up a lot. You know, Dan Ariely's book, Predictably Irrational. The suggestion is that behavior is irrational. But an evolutionary psychologist would say, we do everything in order to get laid, basically. So it's all rational. The inability is not human beings to think about what to do, but simply of economists to explain them. Do you think that irrationality is a fair description of the behavior you're logging?
Yeah, we don't talk much about evolutionary biology in our book, but it strikes me that we evolved in a different circumstance than a modern economy interconnected with the internet. And we have certain patterns that were useful in the past. I think there are certain instinctive patterns we have. So imagine, if you could, that for some strange reason, some kind of wild and dangerous animal came running into this room right now, okay? Certain patterns that evolved over millions of years would immediately, first of all, everyone's heart rate would go up, right? Adrenaline would start flowing. We would take some coordinated action. I don't know what it would be. But right, and so we would everyone would focus attention on this. That's because that's the kind of thing that happened over millions of years, and human society goes quick to focus attention on that. But in the modern world, a lot of the things that happen are like the subprime crisis. I don't know if you know, but in the US, it was kind of new financial institutions were developing that weren't regulated, and they were making loans that didn't make sense. And no one was paying any attention to it. They were too busy flipping apartments and not to think about what was driving the market. So it's those kinds of errors. So in some sense, I think the human species evolved with remarkable success, but the world is changing so fast that some of our instincts, evolution, it needs another 10,000 years at least to get us right in the new world that we live in.
I've often wondered why, if free market economics has this hole at the heart of it, it hasn't been competed away by behavioral economics. In other words, why wouldn't an economist expect that if you're right and their theories have got poor explanatory value, over a 20-year period, which you're talking about, behavioral economics would have made much more headway against the traditional orthodoxy? Or do you think it has?
Well, I've always been puzzled. I've lived my entire I've been in an economics department all my life. And I, to this day, can't understand how my colleagues think, some of them. I go to seminars, and the guy will write this math on the board about consumers maximizing the present discounted value of utility of consumption over their lifetime. And I hate to say it, never sounded right to me. But you know, it's interesting, so I can introspect for a moment. I actually wrote papers like that because everyone else is doing it. You know, I had to get tenure. And I thought, well, there's something good about this. It's interesting. You can get involved with them. I had a long walk with one of my co-authors, We just said, let's have a walk in the city. And I said, you know, Sandy, I really don't believe our model. And that ended our relationship. Although he later dropped out and started a hedge fund, so maybe... So I don't quite understand academia. They do brilliant and wonderful things, but they're herd-like. It's the same phenomenon. There's a herd-like. I just had a student tell me, he came by my office, and he took my course in behavioral economics. And he was telling me about his proposed dissertation. And it was all this same rational, optimizing math econ. And I said, well, you just took my course. Why are you doing this? And not that I opposed it, you know, but I'm saying it's not what I'm into. And he said, oh, I've got to get a job. He said it very plainly.
When you came to the Times, you very interestingly said to us you thought that we'd gone from a situation where we'd been in a boom mentality, we'd gone into a bust, and we'd understood that we'd been in a boom mentality, but now you couldn't understand why we thought we were coming out of the bust. Is that a fair description?
Oh, yeah. The really interesting thing that's happened since March 9th is that every stock market of the world is up dramatically. And then why is that? And this efficient markets theorists have a really easy out. They'll say that some new information about fundamentals must have occurred, and the market sees it first, and individuals can't see it until later. And so don't ask me why it happened. It's not my responsibility. That's an awfully convenient excuse. I think there has to be something that we should be able to see that drove this. But I don't get it. I don't have a good story. That's typical of all these changes. But it's partly because we haven't had bad news lately. You ask me, what would be affecting the whole world? I really don't know. As an American, I'm tempted to think, well, we got Barack Obama, and he's a charismatic leader, but we're only 5% of the world. And so I see the same thing here. You think it's something Gordon Brown said, or I don't know. But then why did it happen in China, too? So I tend to view it...
eliminate that from our inquiries.
Yeah, I tend to view it that we haven't found a way yet to answer. I believe in a different kind of research. I've been doing questionnaire surveys of homeowners and the stock market. I'm doing them still. Not that I've got these things all worked out, but we're trying to listen to people. Economists are opposed, generally, to asking people what they're thinking. And there's a different approach that we might want to take, which is more clinical. Have focus groups and learn how marketing people do that. How are people thinking now, and how is it changing? And until we start collecting data and information. After the stock market crash of 1987, I sent out 3,000 questionnaires within 3 days to institutional and individual. That was the biggest one-day crash in the world history. And I asked them what they were thinking. It turns out I was the only person in the world to do that. I don't know, all of my academic colleagues were still working on projects, but I thought this is important. You know what I found out? Why do we have this? Unfortunately, it looks obvious, but nothing is obvious until you talk to people and ask them. Why did we have this big crash in one day in 1987? What were people thinking about? I asked them, what news stories were you focused on? It turns out I couldn't get any consistent answer except that they were focused on the price declines of the preceding week. And I asked them, what do you think is responsible for the stock market crash? Is it fundamentals or is it psychology? And overwhelmingly they said psychology. So I got, and I asked them, when did you hear about the crash? This is 1987. What time of the day? The average was 2 p.m. This is for a random sample of US investors. And that was before you had internet pocket thing. They heard it word of mouth. During the crash of 1987, it was this kind of event. You're walking down the street and you see someone you vaguely know. They don't normally talk to you, but they stop to you and say, do you know what's happening in the market? Your secretary, who's not interested in economics, suddenly says, you should know what's going on in the market. The Queen probably says it at the same time. So I mentioned this story of the animal coming run into the room. It's these behavior patterns that suddenly appear. But we have to know the coloration and the stories that are attached to them.
One last thing before I throw it open to other people. But one of the things that struck me when I read the subprime solution is that you seem to be arguing that the very idea that there was no such thing as boom and bust anymore could itself be an explanation for why we allowed a boom to happen that was followed by a bust. Is that an unfair summary of your argument?
Right. The conventional wisdom that developed associated with the efficient markets hypothesis, and I'm sure you've heard this before, is don't try to time the market, right? Because the market is efficient, and and why is the market efficient? They would say, well, because you have all of this smart money trying to figure out what the fundamental value is, and they make corrections minute by minute. But then you wait a minute, as you were saying, well, what if everyone takes on the idea that I won't time the market? Then who's smart behind the market anymore? It becomes, it doesn't make sense anymore. The only, and so, in some sense, that's what happened. I keep trying to find these smart investors who are making the market right. And I've talked to many hedge fund operators, and I don't find that they're doing it either. So it seems like there is no mind behind the market. I really believe that most of the fluctuations in the stock market are meaningless.